The hands that opened the mailbox on Circleville's quiet Columbus Street in 1976 had no idea they were about to unleash 23 years of terror. Inside that ordinary metal box sat an envelope that would transform a peaceful Ohio farming community into America's most notorious case of psychological warfare. Mary Gillespie pulled out the letter with her name typed across the front. No return address, no postmark she recognized. The paper felt ordinary enough, but the words inside were anything but normal. In stark black typeface, an anonymous author had laid out intimate details of her life that only someone very close could possibly know. The letter accused Mary of having an affair with Gordon Massey, the school bus driver who transported her children daily. But this wasn't just gossip, it was a threat. The writer warned Mary to end the relationship or face consequences that would destroy everything she held dear. Mary's hands trembled as she read each carefully typed line. Someone in her small town of just over 11,000 residents was watching her every move, documenting her routine, and now making demands. The letter writer claimed to have evidence, photographs, proof of indiscretions that could ruin her marriage and reputation. What made the letter truly chilling wasn't just its content. It was the intimate knowledge displayed by someone who signed only as a concerned citizen. The writer knew Mary's schedule, her children's names, even details about her husband Ron's work patterns. This wasn't random harassment. This was surveillance. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. Mary Gillespie faced an impossible choice that autumn day. She could confess to her husband about accusations that might be entirely fabricated, potentially destroying her marriage over lies. Or she could stay silent and hope the anonymous letter writer would simply disappear. She chose silence, tucking the letter away and trying to convince herself it was a cruel prank that would blow over. But in small-town Circleville, where everyone knew everyone else's business, secrets had a way of multiplying in the dark. The letter writer was just getting started. Over the following weeks, more envelopes appeared, not just in Mary's mailbox, but scattered throughout Circleville like poison seeds. Neighbors, friends, local officials, and business owners all began receiving typed accusations about affairs, corruption, and hidden sins. What had begun as a single threatening letter was evolving into something far more sinister. A systematic campaign of psychological terror that would grip Circleville for decades. Someone in their midst had appointed themselves judge and jury of the entire community, and they were just warming up. The anonymous letter writer had found their voice, and they intended to use it to tear apart everything that made Circleville feel safe. The Gillespie family had lived quietly in Circleville for years, blending seamlessly into the fabric of small-town Ohio life. Ron Gillespie worked as a foreman at the local DuPont plant, providing steady income for his family. Mary kept house and raised their children, living the predictable rhythm of Midwest domesticity that defined their community. But predictability, as the Gillespies were learning, could be shattered by a single sheet of paper. Gordon Massey had driven school buses in Circleville for over a decade, navigating the same rural routes day after day. His passengers knew him as a reliable, friendly driver who got their children safely to and from school. Parents trusted him with their most precious cargo, never suspecting that his daily routine would become the centerpiece of a community-wide nightmare. The allegations in that first letter weren't entirely baseless. Mary Gillespie and Gordon Massey did know each other well, perhaps too well for the comfort of whoever was watching them. In a town where everyone's business became everyone else's concern, even innocent friendships could be twisted into something darker by suspicious minds. What the letter writer seemed to understand, with chilling precision, was exactly how small-town gossip worked. Plant a seed of doubt about an affair, water it with specific details, and watch it grow into a scandal that would consume entire families. The accuser didn't need proof. They just needed plausibility and persistence. As winter settled over Circleville in 1976, more letters began appearing throughout the community. Teachers, shopkeepers, city council members, and ordinary residents found typed accusations waiting in their mailboxes. The anonymous writer seemed to have endless knowledge about private conversations, financial troubles, marital disputes, and family secrets that people thought they'd buried. Each letter followed a similar pattern. typed on a standard typewriter, mailed locally, signed with vague references to concerned citizens or watchful neighbors. The writer never demanded money or specific actions. They seemed motivated purely by a desire to expose and punish what they perceived as moral corruption. Sheriff Dwight Radcliffe received his share of the anonymous correspondence, accusations about his handling of local investigations, and suggestions that corruption reached the highest levels of county government. The letters put him in an impossible position: ignore them and appear incompetent, or investigate every wild claim and tear the community apart from within. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Neighbors began viewing each other with suspicion, wondering who among them was collecting secrets and weaponizing them through the mail. Trust, the foundation of small-town life, started cracking under the weight of anonymous accusations. Mary Gillespie found herself trapped at the center of the storm. Even as more residents received threatening letters, hers remained the most frequent target. The anonymous writer seemed obsessed with her alleged relationship with Gordon Massey, returning to the subject again and again with increasing specificity and venom. The letters described meetings that may or may not have occurred, conversations that could have been innocent or intimate, glances exchanged during routine encounters. The writer transformed ordinary interactions into evidence of adultery, building a case that existed primarily in their own imagination but felt terrifyingly real to anyone reading the accusations. What made the harassment particularly insidious was its patience. The letter writer wasn't rushing toward any obvious goal. They seemed content to maintain a steady campaign of psychological pressure, wearing down their targets through relentless scrutiny rather than explosive confrontation. By early 1977, the letters had become a fixture of Circleville life. Residents checked their mailboxes with dread, never knowing if they'd find accusations waiting inside. The anonymous writer had successfully transformed an entire community into a collection of suspects and victims, each person wondering if they were being watched and judged by invisible eyes. Gordon Massey continued driving his bus routes, but the job had become a daily reminder of the allegations following him through town. Mary Gillespie went about her household routine, but every trip to the grocery store or school event carried the weight of whispered speculation about her private life. The letter writer remained hidden, protected by anonymity, while systematically destroying the peace of mind that had defined Circleville for generations. They had turned the town's greatest strength, everyone knowing everyone, into its greatest weakness. The morning of August 19, 1977, began like any other summer day in Circleville. Children played in backyards while their parents prepared for another day of work and routine. But by sunset, the anonymous letter campaign that had terrorized the community for over a year would claim its first life. Ron Gillespie had reached his breaking point. Month after month of letters targeting his wife had eaten away at his marriage, his peace of mind, and his sense of security. The accusations about Mary's alleged affair with Gordon Massey had become more explicit and more frequent, each envelope containing fresh poison designed to destroy his family from within. That Friday evening, Ron made a decision that would haunt Circleville forever. He loaded his .22 caliber rifle and drove to where Columbus Street intersected with the rural route Gordon Massey traveled. The same intersection where his children caught the school bus each morning had become, in Ron's tormented mind, the symbol of everything wrong with his life. The plan was confrontation, not necessarily murder. Ron wanted answers. He wanted to force the truth out of the man who had become the focus of his anonymous tormentor's obsession. But confrontations involving loaded weapons rarely follow anyone's careful plans. When Gordon Massey's pickup truck approached the intersection that evening, Ron stepped into the road and flagged him down. Witnesses later reported hearing raised voices, an argument that quickly escalated beyond anyone's control. In the gathering dusk of that August night, the psychological warfare that had gripped Circleville for months suddenly turned physical and deadly. The gunshot echoed across the quiet farmland, shattering more than just the evening silence. When the sheriff's deputies arrived, they found Gordon Massey dead and Ron Gillespie standing beside his truck, the rifle still in his hands. The anonymous letter writer had finally achieved what words alone could not. They had turned neighbor against neighbor with lethal results. Ron Gillespie didn't deny shooting Gordon Massey. He was arrested, charged with murder, and faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison. But even as he sat in the Pickaway County Jail, the letters continued arriving throughout Circleville. The anonymous writer seemed energized by the violence they had helped orchestrate. Sheriff Radcliffe found himself investigating both a murder and a campaign of anonymous harassment that had contributed to that murder. The letters had crossed the line from psychological terrorism into actual bloodshed, transforming what had been a disturbing but non-violent crime into something far more serious. The community reaction was swift and divided. Some residents viewed Ron Gillespie as a victim driven to desperate action by relentless psychological torture. Others saw him as a man who had chosen violence over reason, turning suspicion into murder. But everyone agreed on one terrifying fact. The anonymous letter writer was still out there, still typing accusations, still poison pinning their way through Circleville's mailboxes. Mary Gillespie found herself trapped in an impossible position. Her husband faced murder charges, her alleged lover was dead, and the letters targeting her showed no signs of stopping. The anonymous writer seemed to view Gordon Massey's death not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as a victory to be celebrated through continued harassment. The investigation into Gordon Massey's murder proceeded along traditional lines. Ron Gillespie was clearly guilty of pulling the trigger. But the deeper question haunted everyone involved. Who bore responsibility for creating the psychological pressure that had led to violence? Could someone be held accountable for murder committed with words rather than weapons? The letters arriving in the weeks following the shooting contained no expressions of remorse or shock. Instead, the anonymous writer seemed to view the death as justified punishment for moral corruption. They had appointed themselves judge and jury of Circleville's private lives, and Gordon Massey's death was simply the execution of their twisted verdict. As Ron Gillespie awaited trial, the community struggled to understand how anonymous accusations had escalated into homicide. The letters had weaponized gossip and suspicion, turning ordinary citizens into potential killers through carefully crafted psychological manipulation. What made the situation even more chilling was the realization that the anonymous writer had achieved exactly what they seemed to want. They had eliminated Gordon Massey without ever pulling a trigger themselves. They had turned Ron Gillespie into their unwitting executioner, using his love for his wife and his masculine pride as tools for murder. The blood spilled on Columbus Street that August evening marked a turning point in the Circleville letter case. What had begun as harassment had evolved into homicide, proving that words could indeed kill when wielded by someone who understood exactly how to push human beings beyond their breaking point. The murder of Gordon Massey sent shockwaves through Circleville that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. What had once been whispered speculation about anonymous letters suddenly became front-page news, transforming a local harassment problem into a story that captured attention across Ohio and beyond. Ron Gillespie's trial in early 1978 provided the first public glimpse into the psychological warfare that had consumed their community. Prosecutors painted him as a jealous husband who had chosen murder over marriage counseling. Defense attorneys argued that the anonymous letters had created unbearable mental pressure that drove an otherwise peaceful man to violence. The courtroom testimony revealed the true scope of the letter campaign. Dozens of Circleville residents came forward to describe the anonymous correspondence they had received. Teachers spoke of accusations about inappropriate relationships with students. Business owners testified about letters claiming financial corruption. City officials described threats and blackmail attempts that had made governing the community nearly impossible. But the letters hadn't stopped with Gordon Massey's death. If anything, the anonymous writer seemed energized by the violence they had helped orchestrate. New accusations appeared in mailboxes throughout Circleville with increasing frequency and viciousness. The writer had tasted blood, and they wanted more. Mary Gillespie remained the primary target, but her harassment took on a darker tone following the shooting. The letters now accused her of being responsible for two men's destruction, Gordon's death and Ron's imprisonment. The anonymous writer seemed determined to make her suffer for crimes that existed primarily in their own twisted imagination. Sheriff Radcliffe faced mounting pressure to solve the case, but anonymous letter investigations presented unique challenges. Without fingerprints, witnesses, or physical evidence, he was chasing shadows armed with typewriters. The writer was clearly local, They knew too much about too many people to be an outsider. But that narrowed the suspect pool to virtually everyone in Circleville. The investigation focused on the typewriter used to create the letters. Analysis revealed that all the correspondence came from the same machine, a common office model that could be found in businesses, schools, and homes throughout the area. The typing style showed familiarity with proper formatting and business correspondence, suggesting someone with clerical experience or education. But identifying the typewriter proved easier than finding its operator. The anonymous writer was careful never to leave fingerprints on the letters or envelopes. They mailed their poison from different post offices around Pickaway County, never establishing a pattern that might reveal their location. Most cunningly, they seemed to know exactly when to accelerate or pause their campaign to avoid detection. The psychological impact on Circleville deepened with each passing month. Neighbors stopped trusting each other, wondering if friendly conversations were being recorded and twisted into evidence of wrongdoing. Social events became tense affairs where residents watched each other for signs of suspicious knowledge or behavior. Local businesses began suffering as the letter campaign damaged reputations and destroyed professional relationships. The anonymous writer seemed to target anyone who achieved success or prominence in the community, leveling accusations of corruption, adultery, or moral failure against civic leaders, successful merchants, and respected citizens. Children weren't immune to the impact either. They overheard their parents' whispered conversations about the letters and absorbed the fear that permeated every aspect of community life. Some families considered moving away from Circleville entirely, abandoning homes and businesses to escape the anonymous writer's reach. The letters themselves evolved in sophistication and cruelty. Early correspondence had been relatively simple accusations, but the writer was learning to craft more elaborate psychological attacks. They began incorporating specific details that could only have been obtained through careful surveillance, creating the impression that their targets were being watched constantly. Phone calls started accompanying the letters, anonymous voices delivering threats and accusations at all hours of the day and night. The harassment was becoming multimedia, expanding beyond the postal system to invade homes directly through telephone lines. Sleep became difficult for targeted families who never knew when the phone might ring with another dose of anonymous poison. Mary Gillespie found herself trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. Her husband was in prison, her alleged lover was dead, and the letters targeting her showed no signs of stopping. Every trip to the mailbox became an exercise in terror, wondering what fresh accusations awaited her. The anonymous writer had successfully transformed Circleville from a peaceful farming community into a collection of frightened, suspicious individuals who no longer trusted their neighbors or felt secure in their own homes. They had weaponized the postal system and telephone network to create a reign of terror that touched virtually every family in town. What made the situation particularly maddening for law enforcement was the writer's apparent immunity to investigation. They seemed to know when police were getting close, when surveillance was being conducted, and when to adjust their methods to avoid detection. It was as if they had inside information about the investigation itself. The anonymous letter writer had become the invisible ruler of Circleville, controlling the community through fear and suspicion while remaining safely hidden behind their veil of anonymity. By 1983, the Circleville letter case had consumed nearly 7 years of Sheriff Radcliffe's career and thousands of dollars in investigative resources. The anonymous writer had successfully terrorized an entire community while remaining completely invisible to law enforcement. But that was about to change, thanks to a plan that would backfire in the most spectacular way possible. Mary Gillespie had endured more harassment than any single person should be forced to bear. Her husband remained in prison for Gordon Massey's murder. Her reputation lay in tatters from years of anonymous accusations, and the letters targeting her had never stopped. But by the early 1980s, she had transformed from victim into determined fighter, willing to risk everything to catch her tormentor. Working with Sheriff Radcliffe, Mary devised a plan that would use herself as bait to draw the anonymous writer into the open. The strategy was elegantly simple. Create a situation where the letter writer would feel compelled to act physically rather than just sending typed threats through the mail. The trap centered around a specific location along a rural road where Mary often traveled. Law enforcement would monitor the area while Mary followed her normal routine, hoping to spot anyone conducting surveillance or attempting to interfere with her activities. After years of reactive investigation, they were finally taking the offensive against their invisible enemy. On the morning of August 19, 1983, exactly 6 years after Gordon Massey's murder, Mary Gillespie was driving along Circleville's quiet back roads when she noticed something unusual attached to her mailbox post. Someone had tied a cardboard sign to the metal support, and as she slowed down to investigate, she could see writing on the makeshift placard. But as Mary pulled over to examine the sign more closely, her day took a terrifying turn. Hidden behind the cardboard was something far more sinister than another anonymous letter. A booby trap designed to cause serious injury or death. A pistol had been rigged to fire when the sign was disturbed, turning what appeared to be another harassment incident into an attempted murder. The gun mechanism was crude but potentially lethal, a .25 caliber pistol wired to discharge when someone pulled on the attached string. If Mary had approached the sign from the wrong angle or pulled too hard on the cardboard, she could have been shot at close range. The anonymous letter writer had escalated from psychological terrorism to outright assassination attempts. Mary immediately called Sheriff Radcliffe, who arrived with a bomb disposal expert to safely disarm the deadly contraption. For the first time in 7 years of investigation, they had physical evidence that went beyond typed letters and anonymous phone calls. The pistol could be traced, the mechanism examined for fingerprints, and the location processed for any clues the would-be killer might have left behind. The booby trap represented a crucial mistake by the anonymous writer. After years of maintaining perfect operational security through letters and phone calls, they had finally exposed themselves through direct physical action. The gun was registered, the mechanism showed tool marks that could be matched to specific implements, and the location might contain footprints, tire tracks, or other forensic evidence. But the investigation took an unexpected turn when forensic analysis revealed something shocking about the pistol. It was registered to Paul Freshour, a local man who had been peripherally connected to earlier aspects of the case. Freshour worked as a corrections officer and had access to information about Ron Gillespie's imprisonment and the ongoing investigation. Paul Freshour maintained his innocence, claiming that his pistol had been stolen and that he knew nothing about any booby trap. But the physical evidence was damning. His registered weapon had been used in an attempt to murder Mary Gillespie, and his knowledge of the case made him a prime suspect for the years-long letter campaign. The arrest of Paul Freshour sent shockwaves through Circleville. Residents who had lived in fear for nearly a decade suddenly had a face to attach to their anonymous tormentor. The man who had allegedly terrorized their community through carefully crafted letters was revealed to be someone who lived among them. Someone who had watched their fear and fed on their suffering. Freshour's trial would focus heavily on the booby trap evidence, but prosecutors also attempted to link him to the broader letter campaign that had preceded the assassination attempt. Handwriting experts analyzed the typed letters, looking for distinctive patterns that might match samples from Freshour's known correspondence. The case seemed to be reaching its conclusion after 7 years of investigation and community terror. The anonymous letter writer had finally made the fatal mistake that would expose their identity and end their reign of psychological warfare over Circleville. But Paul Freshour's arrest and conviction wouldn't bring peace to the beleaguered community. Instead, it would mark the beginning of an even more disturbing chapter in the Circleville Letters case, one that would prove the anonymous writer was far from finished with their campaign of terror. The booby trap that was meant to silence Mary Gillespie forever had instead opened a door that would lead to revelations no one in Circleville was prepared to face. Paul Freshour's conviction in 1983 for the attempted murder of Mary Gillespie should have marked the end of Circleville's nightmare. The man who had allegedly terrorized an entire community for 7 years was now safely locked away in the Lebanon Correctional Institution, facing a lengthy prison sentence. Sheriff Radcliffe closed the case files, confident that justice had finally been served. But Circleville's residents would soon discover that prison walls couldn't contain the poison pen that had tormented them for so long. Within weeks of Freshour's imprisonment, new anonymous letters began appearing in mailboxes throughout the community. The same typewriter, the same intimate knowledge of local affairs, the same venomous accusations that had defined the campaign since 1976. The letters were postmarked from Columbus, suggesting the writer had moved their base of operations, but the content remained unmistakably familiar. Mary Gillespie received the first of these new letters with growing horror. The anonymous writer seemed to be gloating about Freshour's conviction, claiming that an innocent man was now serving time for crimes he didn't commit. The letter contained details about the trial that only someone closely connected to the case could have known, along with renewed threats against Mary and her family. Sheriff Radcliffe found himself facing an impossible situation. Either Paul Freshour was innocent of the letter campaign despite being guilty of the booby trap attempt, or the anonymous writer had somehow found a way to continue their harassment from inside a maximum security prison. Both possibilities challenged everything law enforcement thought they understood about the case. The new letters displayed the same psychological sophistication that had characterized the campaign from the beginning. The writer knew exactly which buttons to push, which secrets to expose, which fears to exploit for maximum emotional damage. They seemed to have unlimited time to craft their poison and unlimited knowledge about their targets' private lives. Prison officials at Lebanon Correctional were asked to investigate whether Freshour could be sending letters from his cell. Mail censorship procedures were tightened, his cell was searched repeatedly, and his movements were monitored constantly. But no evidence emerged connecting him to the new wave of anonymous correspondence. What made the situation even more bizarre was Freshour's own behavior behind bars. Rather than maintaining his innocence quietly, he became an vocal advocate for his own case, writing letters to newspapers, lawyers, and anyone who would listen. He claimed that the real anonymous letter writer was still free while he served time for a crime he didn't commit. Freshour's letters from prison were signed with his name and return address, the complete opposite of anonymous correspondence. He seemed desperate to prove his innocence, offering to take lie detector tests, submit handwriting samples, and cooperate with any investigation that might clear his name. This behavior was inconsistent with someone who had spent years carefully concealing their identity. The continuing letter campaign put enormous pressure on Mary Gillespie, who had hoped that Freshour's conviction would finally bring peace to her shattered life. Instead, she found herself receiving threats that seemed more personal and vindictive than ever before. The anonymous writer appeared to blame her for Freshour's imprisonment and was determined to make her suffer for it. Local residents who had celebrated the end of their nightmare found themselves back in the same psychological prison they had inhabited for years. Mailboxes became sources of dread once again. Telephone calls brought fresh anxiety, and the community trust that had slowly begun healing after Freshour's arrest was shattered anew. The letters from this period showed a disturbing evolution in the writer's methods. They began incorporating information about ongoing investigations, suggesting that the anonymous correspondent had sources within law enforcement itself. Details about evidence, witness statements, and investigative strategies appeared in the harassment correspondence with frightening accuracy. Sheriff Radcliffe faced growing criticism from residents who questioned whether the right man had been imprisoned. If Freshour was the anonymous letter writer, how could the harassment continue from his prison cell? If he was innocent, why had he attempted to kill Mary Gillespie with a booby trap? The case that had seemed solved was becoming more complicated than ever. The psychological impact on Paul Freshour himself was devastating. Imprisoned for a crime he claimed he didn't commit, watching helplessly as the real perpetrator continued their campaign from the shadows, he began a legal battle that would consume the rest of his life. His letters from prison became increasingly desperate as he realized that his conviction might have been based on circumstantial evidence linking him to crimes he never committed. The anonymous writer seemed to be enjoying the chaos they had created around Freshour's case. Their letters gloated about the confusion, the wrongful imprisonment, and the continuing inability of law enforcement to identify the real culprit. They had successfully framed an innocent man while remaining free to continue their psychological warfare. By 1985, it was clear that Paul Freshour's imprisonment had solved nothing. The anonymous letter campaign that had terrorized Circleville for nearly a decade was continuing with renewed vigor, proving that the real perpetrator was still out there, still hidden, and still determined to make an entire community suffer for sins that existed primarily in their own twisted imagination. The revelation that the anonymous letters were continuing despite Paul Freshour's imprisonment created a crisis of confidence that rippled through every level of the investigation. By 1985, Sheriff Radcliffe faced the uncomfortable reality that either his department had imprisoned an innocent man, or they were dealing with a criminal conspiracy more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The new letters arriving throughout Circleville carried a tone of triumph and mockery that chilled everyone who read them. The anonymous writers seemed to relish the confusion surrounding Freshour's case, crafting correspondence that alternated between gloating about the wrongful conviction and delivering fresh threats against their original targets. Mary Gillespie found herself trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The letters targeting her had become more personal and vindictive than ever before, filled with intimate details about her daily routine that could only come from constant surveillance. Someone was still watching her every move, documenting her activities, and using that information to craft psychological torture. What made the continuing harassment particularly disturbing was the writer's apparent access to information about the ongoing investigation itself. Letters contained references to witness statements, evidence analysis, and investigative strategies that should have been known only to law enforcement personnel. The anonymous correspondent seemed to have sources within the sheriff's department or prosecutor's office. The investigation into the continuing letters revealed disturbing gaps in the original case against Paul Freshour. While the booby trap had definitely been constructed using his registered pistol, the connection between that single incident and the 7-year letter campaign was largely circumstantial. Freshour had been in the right place at the wrong time, but that didn't necessarily make him the anonymous writer. Prison officials conducted extensive searches of Freshour's cell and monitored his mail constantly, but found no evidence linking him to the new correspondence. His outgoing letters were all signed with his name and contained pleas for help proving his innocence rather than anonymous threats against community members. The man imprisoned for terrorizing Circleville seemed to be the one person in Ohio who wasn't sending anonymous letters. The psychological profile of the anonymous writer began to shift as investigators realized they might be dealing with someone entirely different from Paul Freshour. The real letter writer appeared to be someone with deep roots in the community, extensive knowledge of local affairs, and possibly connections to law enforcement or government that provided access to confidential information. Freshour's own letters from prison painted a picture of a man desperately trying to prove his innocence, while the real perpetrator remained free to continue their campaign. He wrote to newspapers, lawyers, and anyone who might be able to help him clear his name. His correspondence was emotional, sometimes rambling, but always signed and never anonymous. The continuing letter campaign also revealed the writer's true motivation, which seemed to go far beyond the original accusations against Mary Gillespie and Gordon Massey. The anonymous correspondent appeared to be driven by a desire to control and manipulate an entire community through fear and suspicion. They had found a method of psychological warfare that allowed them to remain safely hidden while wielding enormous power over their neighbors' lives. Local residents who had hoped that Freshour's imprisonment would bring peace found themselves living in the same atmosphere of dread they had endured for nearly a decade. The letters were arriving with increased frequency, targeting new victims and revisiting old accusations with fresh venom. The anonymous writer seemed energized by the chaos surrounding the wrongful conviction. The case began attracting attention from outside investigators who specialized in anonymous harassment campaigns. Behavioral analysts noted that the continuing letters showed none of the psychological deterioration typically seen when perpetrators are imprisoned or under extreme stress. Instead, the correspondence maintained the same careful planning and intimate knowledge that had characterized the campaign from the beginning. Mary Gillespie's situation became increasingly desperate as the new letters escalated their threats and accusations. The anonymous writer blamed her for Freshour's imprisonment and seemed determined to make her pay for what they portrayed as a miscarriage of justice. Her daily routine became an exercise in constant vigilance, never knowing when the next threat might materialize into actual violence. The investigation faced another disturbing possibility, that the anonymous letter writer might be someone within law enforcement itself, someone with access to case files and inside information about the investigation. This theory would explain the writer's apparent immunity to detection and their knowledge of confidential investigative details. Sheriff Radcliffe found himself investigating his own department, looking for signs that someone with a badge might be responsible for terrorizing the community they had sworn to protect. The possibility that the anonymous writer was a police officer, prosecutor, or court employee created a crisis of trust that threatened to undermine the entire criminal justice system in Pickaway County. By 1986, 10 years after the first anonymous letter arrived in Mary Gillespie's mailbox, the case had evolved into something far more complex than anyone had originally imagined. Paul Freshour remained in prison for the booby trap incident, but the real anonymous letter writer was still out there, still hidden, and still determined to prove that they could terrorize an entire community with complete impunity. The poison pen that had started with accusations of adultery had evolved into a demonstration of power that mocked law enforcement and left an entire community wondering if justice was even possible when the criminal might be hiding among those sworn to uphold the law. The breakthrough in the Circleville Letters case came from an unexpected source: the United States Postal Service's Investigative Division. By 1987, 11 years after the harassment campaign began, federal postal inspectors had grown frustrated with the local investigation's lack of progress and decided to apply their specialized expertise to catching the anonymous writer. Postal Inspector Bill McCauley brought sophisticated techniques to bear on the case that had stumped local law enforcement for over a decade. His team began conducting microscopic analysis of the paper, envelopes, and postmarks used in the letters, looking for patterns that might reveal the writer's location or purchasing habits. The federal investigation revealed something Sheriff Radcliffe's department had missed. The anonymous letters weren't being mailed randomly throughout central Ohio, as previously believed. Instead, they followed distinct geographic patterns that suggested the writer lived or worked in specific areas around Circleville and Columbus. The postmark analysis created a map of the perpetrator's movements that began to narrow down their possible locations. More importantly, the postal inspectors noticed subtle changes in the letters that corresponded with significant events in the case. When Paul Freshour was imprisoned, the writing style and mailing patterns shifted slightly, suggesting that the real anonymous writer had been forced to adjust their methods. These adjustments provided clues about the perpetrator's true identity and circumstances. The federal team also applied behavioral analysis techniques that painted a psychological profile of the anonymous writer. The perpetrator was likely someone with clerical experience, extensive knowledge of the local community, and possible connections to law enforcement or government. Most significantly, the writer appeared to be motivated by a desire for control rather than money, revenge, or sexual obsession. Mary Gillespie had endured more than a decade of harassment by this point, but she remained determined to see her tormentor brought to justice. Working closely with postal inspectors, she agreed to participate in sophisticated surveillance operations designed to catch the writer in the act of mailing or placing letters. The breakthrough came through careful analysis of the typewriter used to create the anonymous correspondence. Federal experts determined that the machine had a distinctive flaw in one of its keys that created a unique impression on every letter typed. This flaw was so specific that it could definitively link any document to the exact typewriter used to create it. Armed with this knowledge, postal inspectors began a systematic search for the typewriter throughout central Ohio. They examined machines in businesses, schools, government offices, and private homes, looking for the one device that could have produced 11 years' worth of anonymous terror. The search led investigators to focus on individuals who had access to multiple locations where typewriters might be found. The anonymous writer had demonstrated extensive knowledge of many different aspects of community life, suggesting someone whose work or activities brought them into contact with various institutions and organizations throughout Circleville. The investigation began centering on Karen Sue Freshour, Paul Freshour's ex-wife, who worked as a school bus driver and had access to typewriters at multiple locations. Her intimate knowledge of Gordon Massey's bus routes, her complicated relationship with her ex-husband, and her position within the community made her a person of intense interest to federal investigators. Karen Sue had been overlooked during the original investigation, dismissed as another victim of the anonymous letter campaign rather than a potential perpetrator. But the postal inspectors noticed that she had received far fewer threatening letters than other community members, despite being married to the man originally suspected of the harassment. The behavioral profile created by federal analysts fit Karen Sue Freshour with disturbing accuracy. She had the local knowledge necessary to write the letters, access to typewriters through her work, and intimate familiarity with the school bus system that had been central to many of the accusations. Most importantly, she had a clear motive for framing her ex-husband Paul for crimes she was committing. Surveillance of Karen Sue revealed patterns of behavior that matched the anonymous letter campaign's timeline. She made frequent trips to various post offices throughout central Ohio, always paying cash for stamps and never establishing regular patterns that might attract attention. Her movements corresponded closely with the mailing locations identified through postmark analysis. The psychological motive became clearer as investigators delved deeper into Karen Sue's background. She had been involved in a bitter divorce with Paul Freshour, harbored resentment about various aspects of community life, and seemed to enjoy the power that came from terrorizing her neighbors while remaining hidden. The anonymous letter campaign had allowed her to settle personal scores while watching an entire community suffer. The federal investigation had spent months building an airtight case against Karen Sue Freshour, but they needed definitive proof linking her to the typewriter used to create the letters. That proof would come from an unexpected source: Karen Sue's own overconfidence in her ability to remain hidden after more than a decade of successful deception. The final trap for Karen Sue Freshour was set in motion through a carefully orchestrated operation that combined old-fashioned police work with cutting-edge forensic science. By late 1987, postal inspectors had built a circumstantial case against Paul Freshour's ex-wife, but they needed concrete evidence linking her to the typewriter that had terrorized Circleville for over 11 years. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Karen Sue had access to a typewriter at the Circleville School District where she worked as a bus driver. The machine was located in the transportation office, available to drivers for completing paperwork and reports. More importantly, it was a model that matched the specifications identified by federal forensic experts. Postal Inspector Macaulay devised a plan to obtain a sample from the suspected typewriter without alerting Karen Sue to their investigation. Working with school officials, they arranged for routine maintenance on the machine that would provide legitimate access for forensic examination. The typewriter sample would either eliminate the machine as a suspect or provide definitive proof of its role in the harassment campaign. The forensic analysis results were unambiguous. The distinctive key flaw that had marked every anonymous letter for over a decade was present in the school district's typewriter. After 11 years of investigation, countless false leads, and one wrongful conviction, law enforcement had finally identified the machine used to terrorize an entire community. But having the typewriter wasn't the same as proving Karen Sue Freshour had used it to write the letters. The machine was accessible to multiple school employees, and prosecutors would need additional evidence to secure a conviction. The postal inspectors decided to employ a technique that had proven successful in other anonymous letter cases. They would watch and wait for the perpetrator to make a mistake. Karen Sue had grown increasingly bold as the years passed without detection. The successful framing of her ex-husband for the booby trap incident had convinced her that she was untouchable. This overconfidence would prove to be her undoing when investigators set up comprehensive surveillance of her activities and movements. The surveillance operation revealed Karen Sue's sophisticated understanding of how to avoid detection. She varied her mailing locations, used different post offices throughout central Ohio, and never established patterns that might attract attention. But federal investigators had the patience and resources to maintain long-term observation, something the local sheriff's department had never been able to accomplish. The decisive evidence came when postal inspectors observed Karen Sue entering the school transportation office during off hours, spending time alone with the typewriter, and then mailing letters from various locations over the following days. Hidden cameras captured her using the machine, while postmark analysis confirmed that anonymous letters appeared in Circleville mailboxes shortly after her typing sessions. The psychological profile that had led investigators to Karen Sue proved remarkably accurate. She was indeed motivated by a desire for control and power over her community, enjoying the fear and suspicion she had created while remaining safely hidden behind her anonymous persona. The letter campaign had allowed her to settle personal grievances while watching her neighbors suffer. Karen Sue's selection of victims revealed the personal nature of her campaign. Mary Gillespie had been targeted not because of any actual affair, but because Karen Sue resented her position in the community and her relationship with Gordon Massey. Other victims had been chosen based on perceived slights, professional jealousies, or simply because they represented the kind of respectability that Karen Sue felt had been denied to her. The decision to frame Paul Freshour for the booby trap incident showed the depths of Karen Sue's hatred for her ex-husband. She had used his registered pistol to construct the device, knowing that the physical evidence would lead directly to him while she remained hidden. The plan had worked perfectly, sending an innocent man to prison while she continued her harassment campaign from the shadows. When federal agents finally arrested Karen Sue Freshour in December 1987, she maintained her innocence despite overwhelming evidence. The typewriter analysis, surveillance footage, and behavioral profile created an airtight case that prosecutors were confident would result in conviction. After 11 years, the anonymous letter writer had finally been dragged into the light. The arrest sent shockwaves through Circleville, where residents had lived in fear for over a decade. Many found it difficult to believe that their tormentor had been hiding in plain sight, driving school buses, and living among them, while systematically destroying their peace of mind. Karen Sue had attended community events, participated in local activities, and maintained friendly relationships with some of the same people she was terrorizing through the mail. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. The investigation had revealed the true nature of anonymous harassment campaigns. They were often perpetrated by individuals who appeared normal and trustworthy on the surface, while harboring deep resentments and psychological problems that drove them to inflict suffering on others. Karen Sue Freshour had weaponized the postal system and her intimate knowledge of community life to become Circleville's invisible dictator of fear. Karen Sue Freshour's trial in 1988 should have marked the definitive end of Circleville's 12-year nightmare. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Forensic analysis linked her to the typewriter, surveillance footage showed her using the machine, and behavioral analysis confirmed she fit the psychological profile perfectly. Yet, even as she sat in court facing multiple felony charges, the most disturbing chapter of the Circleville Letters case was about to unfold. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman consumed by resentment and jealousy, someone who had systematically destroyed her community's peace through carefully crafted psychological warfare. They presented evidence showing how Karen Sue had used her position as a school bus driver to gather intelligence about families, how she had framed her ex-husband for attempted murder, and how she had terrorized hundreds of innocent people for over a decade. Defense attorneys argued that the case against Karen Sue was circumstantial, that access to a typewriter didn't prove authorship of the letters, and that investigators had focused on her only after exhausting other suspects. They suggested that the real anonymous writer might still be out there, using Karen Sue as a convenient scapegoat just as they had used Paul Freshour years earlier. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts of menacing by stalking and making terroristic threats. Karen Sue Freshour was sentenced to 7 years in prison, finally paying for more than a decade of psychological terrorism that had torn apart her community's fabric of trust and security. But Circleville's residents would soon discover that imprisoning Karen Sue Freshour hadn't ended their nightmare. It had merely paused it. Within months of her incarceration, new anonymous letters began appearing in mailboxes throughout the community. The same intimate knowledge of local affairs, the same venomous accusations, the same psychological sophistication that had characterized the campaign since 1976. Investigators faced the impossible reality that either they had imprisoned another innocent person, or the Circleville letter writer had found ways to continue their harassment from behind prison walls. Mary Gillespie, who had hoped that Karen Sue's conviction would finally bring peace to her shattered life, received some of the first new letters with growing despair. The anonymous writer seemed to be gloating about the wrongful conviction, claiming that the real perpetrator was still free while another innocent person served time for crimes they didn't commit. Federal postal inspectors found themselves investigating a case that defied conventional understanding. Prison officials confirmed that Karen Sue's mail was monitored, her cell was searched regularly, and she had no unauthorized access to typewriters or writing materials. Yet the letters continued with the same frequency and malevolence that had defined them for over a decade. The investigation revealed a disturbing possibility that had haunted the case from the beginning. The Circleville Letters might be the work of multiple perpetrators working in coordination. Karen Sue Freshour might have been one writer among several, or she might have trained someone else to continue the campaign in her absence. Even more chilling was the possibility that the anonymous letter writer had evolved beyond any single individual. The campaign had taken on a life of its own, inspiring copycat harassment that maintained the same psychological techniques while drawing from an ever-expanding pool of local knowledge and resentment. Paul Freshour, still imprisoned for the booby trap incident despite growing evidence of his innocence, continued his desperate legal battle to clear his name. His letters from prison had become increasingly frantic as he watched the real perpetrators remain free while he served time for crimes he insisted he never committed. The continuing letters revealed something profoundly disturbing about human nature and community dynamics. Circleville had become a laboratory for psychological warfare, demonstrating how anonymous harassment could be weaponized to destroy trust, create suspicion, and transform neighbors into enemies. The letter writer had succeeded in fundamentally altering the character of an entire community. By 1994, 18 years after the first anonymous letter appeared in Mary Gillespie's mailbox, the harassment campaign had outlasted multiple suspects, survived numerous convictions, and adapted to every investigative technique applied against it. The letters had become a permanent fixture of Circleville life, a malevolent force that seemed to exist independently of any single perpetrator. Residents who had lived through nearly 2 decades of psychological terrorism began to wonder if the letters would ever truly stop. The anonymous writer had achieved a kind of immortality through their campaign, creating a legacy of fear and suspicion that transcended any individual criminal. They had transformed themselves from a person into a phenomenon. The Circleville Letters case had revealed uncomfortable truths about the power of anonymous harassment and the fragility of community trust. A single individual armed with nothing more than a typewriter and intimate local knowledge had successfully terrorized hundreds of people for decades, proving that psychological warfare could be more devastating than physical violence. Mary Gillespie, now in her 50s and having endured nearly 20 years of harassment, continued to receive threatening letters. The woman who had been the primary target since 1976 remained trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end, no resolution, and no escape. The anonymous letter writer had achieved their ultimate victory. They had become eternal, a force of malevolence that would haunt Circleville long after everyone involved in the original case had died or moved away. The letters that had started with accusations of adultery had evolved into something far more sinister, a demonstration that evil, once unleashed, can take on a life of its own.